It was early afternoon when we got the call. The man on the other end of the line sounded rushed, confused, and kept repeating that there were two passed-out puppies lying on the shoulder of a rural road, near a bend where cars sped by. I wrote down the location, and we left immediately. Our team already knew. When someone describes a puppy as passed out, most of the time, it's on the brink of death. And we had no time to lose. When we arrived at the scene, we saw a small group of people standing by the roadside. No one dared to approach the dogs. Some were watching from a distance, others avoided looking altogether. As we got out of the car, we spotted the two puppies lying side by side. One was completely still, the other trembling uncontrollably, like its body was gasping for air. The first thing I noticed was the heat of the asphalt rising through my legs. I imagined what those animals had endured, lying there under the burning sun. They were both covered in dust, their fur dirty and dried out. They were extremely thin. You could count every rib, and their eyes, sunken, dry, barely reacted to light. We put on gloves and acted fast. We lifted the two puppies and laid them on damp towels to try to bring down their body temperature. One of them, the weakest, didn't respond to anything. No movement, no sound. The other twitched slightly, as if drowning in dry air. On the way to the clinic, we opened the windows for ventilation and used small bottles of water to moisten their mouths. We couldn't force anything. There was a serious risk of choking. While we drove, we called the on-duty vet, explained the situation, and asked that everything be ready for immediate care. I was holding the puppy that was still breathing, and I could feel his heartbeat, faint, like a drum about to go silent. When we arrived at the clinic, the team was waiting. Both puppies were taken inside and placed on small stretchers. The vet confirmed it. Both were in metabolic coma, extreme malnutrition, severe dehydration, and imminent organ failure. They could die at any moment. If it hadn't been for the quick report, they wouldn't have lasted another hour on that road. It was a race against time, and we didn't know if we were going to win. The first few hours were critical. For fluids, body warming, injectable vitamins, and antibiotics. While the team worked, I stood by the door watching. I remembered that during the rescue, an older woman asked why we were trying so hard. "They're just two puppies," she said. That phrase echoed in my mind. To many people, they were invisible. To us, they were lives worth fighting for, until the very last second. By the end of the day, the vet called us over. He said the puppy that had been unresponsive was beginning to show involuntary reflexes. It wasn't much, but it was a sign. The other one, who had struggled more to breathe, had stabilized. Still unconscious, but alive. That night, we barely slept. The clinic let us stay in a side room where we could check in constantly. It was a silent vigil, where every breath they took made us hold ours. The next morning, when I opened my eyes, I saw one of the vet nurses running toward us. "One of them moved his paw," she said. We rushed to the recovery room. The weaker puppy was now moving his nose, trying to sniff the air. He didn't open his eyes yet, but his body was reacting. It was like he was waking up from a long nightmare. The other one was still motionless, but breathing more steadily. Our hope was growing. We brought in a specialized caregiver to help in the coming days. The puppies couldn't feed on their own. We used syringes to give them small amounts of special formula, all done in silence with slow, precise movements. Every tiny improvement was a restrained celebration. We didn't want to raise false hopes. We'd seen cases like this end in silence, but something told us these two wanted to live. On the third day, the first puppy, the one who moved his paw, opened his eyes. It was a moment no one forgot. Tiny, dried eyes, but alive. He tried to lift his head, failed, and tried again. His strength was minimal, but his will was clear. We gave him a temporary name, Tico. The other, still unresponsive, we called Nino. From then on, every step was documented, every milestone recorded with photos and videos. Tico started moving more. He would lie on his side, dragging his legs, looking for warmth. We placed a heating pad under a blanket to simulate a mother's warmth, and he curled up right away. It was as if his body remembered something instinctual. Nino, on the other hand, remained in a deep state of torpor, but his heart rate was consistent and his glucose levels were finally stabilizing. During that first week, Tico could already sit up with some help. He tried to bark, but his throat was still weak. His eyes followed us whenever we walked into the room, and it was impossible not to get attached. Even the most experienced professionals on our team started caring for him with almost maternal tenderness. It was like watching a newborn rediscover the world, except this one carried a past no creature should ever endure. On the 8th day, Nino finally showed signs of consciousness. He slightly wagged his tail and let out a long sigh. We stood in silence for a few seconds until someone said, "He's back." The whole room celebrated. Now we had 2 survivors. 2 puppies who defied the odds, the road, the abandonment. 2 little bodies that refused to die alone, dumped like trash. The next 48 hours were critical. Nino couldn't feed on his own, but he accepted milk through a syringe. His eyes opened slowly, and even without focus, he seemed to recognize sounds. Whenever Tico cried, Nino tried to move his head. The bond between them was real, deep. Maybe they had kept each other warm while waiting for help by that roadside. It was as if one had given the other the strength to endure. The improvements continued. Tico was already taking his first clumsy steps. Nino began to crawl, looking for closeness. We placed the 2 of them together on a blanket and watched as they touched each other again for the first time since the rescue. It was a quiet reunion, but powerful. No barking, no sudden movements. Just 2 exhausted puppies who were finally safe, warm, and alive. By the end of the 2nd week, both could eat without help. They were still thin, fragile, and would need weeks of recovery. But the worst was over. They had survived the cruelest part, abandonment, and every small victory they achieved was felt by all of us. Because it wasn't just about saving lives, it was about giving those lives the chance to begin again with dignity. The 2 were temporarily placed in a home with one of our team members. There, they received constant affection, controlled meals, and space to play. Even though they were still weak, their personalities began to emerge. Tico was more active and curious. Nino was calm and observant, but they were always together. They slept side by side, as if afraid of being separated again. We never left them alone.